Welcome back. This is The Heavy Hitter. I always wanted to be a doctor, so it was no surprise to my family when I left for medical school in 2015, even if my dad had conflicting thoughts about it. You see, while he supported my dream above and beyond what I could ever ask from an incredible parent, he knew me better than I thought. The trouble was, and still is, I've always been a stubborn patient. I hate the smell of hospitals, and most importantly, the why or the root cause behind something has always been my focus. Needless to say, unless absolutely necessary, I never really cared for medications. The reason I'm sharing this makes sense later, so hold on. I chose to attend school in the Caribbean, the beautiful island of Dominica. Incredible people, gorgeous sunsets, beaches, amazing food, and more. And I'd love to say that medical school was everything that I dreamt, that things went great in all aspects of my life. But it was anything that. You see, I didn't respond well in that highly stressful environment or to any of the new experiences. I didn't thrive. I barely held on. I was insomnia driven, taking 1 hour naps because I'd sleep 2 to 4 hours overnight. I was reckless. I was my own worst enemy. Honestly, the absolute worst of my personality came through, and I hate to admit it, but I was ashamed of that behavior, and I held much regret for years because of it. My relationships, friendships, academics, everything suffered, and everything went south. Second semester was a turning point in my life. It was a reckoning I wasn't prepared for. I had completely lost all of my peace. Nothing made sense, and I was in constant worry. Something had to change, so I started reading my Bible. Full disclosure, I had never read it in its entirety, especially the Old Testament, and I had many reservations, but it's true, isn't it? We seek God only when it benefits us, when we're at the end of our rope, so that's what I did. The more I read my Bible, though, the less peace I had. And by November of that year, strange, unexplainable things started to happen. For example, I remember picking up my brand new Apple charger by the adapter, and yet before my very own eyes, the cord snapped in half. I brushed it off, thinking maybe I tugged at it at some point. But then things only got worse. I started to see, quote, a woman on the right side of my body. The more I read my Bible, the more it screamed in my ears, and its features shifted. By the end of that month, it was rotting, with long, sharp black talons, a black tongue that would stick out as it screamed, gray skin. It was terrifying. It was at this point that I started to question my sanity. Did I have some mental illness I wasn't aware of? Had I experienced a psychotic break? What was wrong with me? Needless to say, I was distracted, traumatized, and tormented. I didn't perform well on any of my exams, and I was constantly on edge. I didn't know who to ask for help, but the right people always came along. I remember in December of that year, just as I was preparing for the final exam, I shared with Mona, another student, that I was seeing things that weren't there. She shared her own stories and said, "Let's pray. I'm going to pray for you." And I will never forget what happened next. As she stood and held my hands, the first words out of her mouth were, "The second I touched you, the left side of my body went cold." And as she prayed, we both watched as something tried to yank my right hand out of her left, and as something stabbed my left foot. I was wearing flats, and the round quarter-inch indents were unmistakable. I failed that semester. I'm not surprised. Are you? When I got back to the States, I was crushed, utterly defeated. I broke down, which was hard enough to begin with, but remember I said I'm not big on vulnerability or tears? Yeah, well, I cried. I remember during Christmas break, sitting in my room and crying my little old heart out. And as I cried out to God, all of a sudden this electrical warm peace surrounded me. I felt something pour out from the top of my head to the tip of my toes, and the tears dried. I tried to make myself cry. Nothing. I had peace for the first time in almost a year. And a plaque on my wall started to bang. I still have it. It says, "When one door closes, another opens." And I knew in that moment that God had met me again in my mess. I decided to go back to school. And again, I'd like to say it started well, but it didn't. I was depressed, and although I dealt with that for years, I wasn't prepared for this level of agony. Everyone who talked about hitting rock bottom forgot to tell me that rock bottom has a basement. I lost 20 pounds in 2 weeks from my already tiny frame. I wasn't eating, and I had trouble getting out of bed, so no surprise I wasn't studying or preparing for my exams. February 1st of 2016, I hit the end of my rope. I had my first exam the next morning, but I was desperate for something. That night, around 11 p.m., just before I hopped into the shower, I dropped to my knees and cried out for God. I begged him to help me, demanded that if he allowed this sickness, the depression, in my life, that he could take it away. As I talked to him out loud, I saw two images flash into my mind on how to kill myself. That hit me like a force. And it was in that moment that I knew it wasn't me. Why would I have those thoughts if I'm asking God, talking to him desperately out loud? I demanded that God come down right then and there to help me. And just as I finished saying that, there was a knock on my door. I remember my eyes flew up and I asked God, "Did you really come down for me?" But I was in a towel, late at night, red-eyed, embarrassed, so I ignored it and just hopped into the shower. The next morning, around 7, I had the exact same prayer, in the same posture, but with clothes on this time. And again, as I demanded that God come down to help me right then and there was another knock at my door. This time, I had no choice but to open it. I mean, I had to leave for the exam anyway. I opened the door, surprised to see my landlord, Gloria. She said my neighbor heard me crying and had called her. I was touched that this stranger would show up for me. She asked if I was okay. Obviously, one look at my face and you could tell I was dying a little inside. I lied. But something told me to ask her to pray for me twice. I brushed that off both times and pushed her away. The second she rounded those stairs, I remembered she was a pastor. I left for my exam. Halfway through, I gave up and just clicked on random answers. I knew I needed help, desperately. And well, a well-meaning friend had already contacted the school on my behalf. At the time, I wish they had just said it to me, but I see why now they didn't. Immediately after the exam, I went to the school psychologist. They asked me to complete forms, questionnaires, etc. And go figure, the second quote test that I took that semester would be the one that I aced. That's terrifying. I spoke with the screener, and I remember as she asked me my history, she questioned why my parents never got me help. I didn't skip a beat as I told her my parents have given me everything a child could ask for, putting us, my siblings and I, above them. How then could I have turned around and said it's not enough? I watched as her eyes filled with tears, and I knew in that moment she couldn't help me. She was too sympathetic and not empathetic. I left. And in that 5-minute walk from campus to my apartment, I had an email from the school saying that my follow-up appointment had been bumped from the following week to first thing in the morning. I reached out to Gloria, and all I asked if I could talk to her. And instantly she responded with a passage from Isaiah, where the writer had felt that God had physically turned his face from him. I remember reading that scripture over and over again and asking God, how does she know? She said she'd meet with me the next week, and I looked forward to it. Well, I went back to the school psychologist the next morning, and I wasn't surprised when they told me I needed to take a high dosage of depression medication. I put my foot down and said no. And although I still had no relationship with God, I remember looking at her and saying, if God allowed this, only he can take it away. And to this day, I'm blown away by that level of faith. She asked me why I wanted to be a doctor, if I didn't believe in medication, and what if a similar patient went through the same thing. I told her my whys, and eventually she agreed on the conditional term that I visit her every week. Gloria visited the following week, in the early afternoon, and good Lord, for over an hour, this woman of God prayed for me in a language I had never heard of, and I watched suspicious, but desperate. And as she prayed, covered in sweat, with multiple fans pointing at her, a black shadow lifted from my chest and disappeared. That very moment, a warmth covered me, and the depression was gone. It was night and day. I knew something changed. I was free. When I went back to the psychologist the next morning, she was amazed and asked me what happened. Honestly, I don't know where this word came from, but I remember looking at her with this bright, joyful smile on my face and saying, God vindicated me. She wrote the word down, had a puzzled look on her face, and typical of me, asked if she thought I was bipolar. She shook her head, smiled, and said no. But remember I said the right people always come along to help? Yeah, well, one of them is Anthony. He's my spiritual brother. If you're listening, Anthony, thank you. And for everybody else, y'all need to join me in prayer for this man, because I put him through grief. I pushed his buttons repeatedly, and I'm so grateful that almost 7 years later, he's still an incredible older brother. Anyway, back to the story. Just days after my deliverance, what I realize now was a deliverance, Anthony asked me, will you join us for a week-long fast? Sure, I responded. He was surprised and said, I thought that would take more to convince you. And I laughed and I said no, I could lose some weight. I was thriving in love with God and had finally gained weight. Priorities, right? And well, that was another defining moment in my life. That first day, as I joined over 15 students to pray during this fast, I will never forget how shocked I was. Little old me, who grew up in a Baptist church, well, not really, had walked into a prayer group where everyone was praying out loud, pacing back and forth in languages I didn't think existed. I remember turning towards the wall, pulling my shoulders in, and saying to God, "Oh my God, I'm in a cult. Jesus, help me." I was doing my absolute best to make myself invisible. Some things don't change. And I remember Anthony marched right over to me. He turned me to face him and prayed in that same language. And as I squeezed my eyes shut, an image played like a movie in my mind. It was a wine cup, empty, but I watched as it filled and overflowed. It was beautiful. I grew some, I regressed some in my walk with God. I was on an emotional high, and all the love that my non existent heart could contain, well, it was that. Each day, I went back to pray with them, and over the course of that week, I saw a field of sheep, all black, walking away from their shepherd. By midweek, half had stopped and looked back. By the end of the week, they were all white and running back towards the shepherd. I was over the moon and utterly in love with God. So in March of 2016, I officially gave my life to God and was baptized before a group of witnesses.